been coming to the Philippines since the 1950s. For an American, landing in Manila is a shock of recognition. For half a century, half a world away, this was America's only colony, and the flavor is still American.
Inside to outside, right here on the #1 pop music station in Metro.
Disc jockeys, minibuses modeled on Jeeps, billboards, public buildings, fast food outlets, all evoke America. America's two largest overseas bases are here, supporting America's presence from Pacific to the Persian Gulf. Before America came at the turn of the century, Spain ruled for 300 years, making the Philippines the only Christian nation in Asia. It can be almost medieval Christianity, as dramatized in this reenactment of the crucifixion. The centuries of colonialism also made the Philippines the most westernized nation of Asia. This series looks at how the Americans got to the Philippines, what they did there, what they left there. They wanted to remold the Filipinos in the American image, in our image. The United States was booming at the turn of the century. It was fast becoming the world's leading industrial nation. Its mines, mills, and factories were turning out coal, iron, steel, consumer goods. Immigrants were swelling its labor force. New roads, railways, and telegraph lines linked its cities. The people's pulse is quick, nervous, feverish, wrote a newspaper editor at the time. Americans were bursting with new power and national pride. This dynamic youth and energy built up pressures to propel America beyond its shores for the first time in history. Veterans and their families commemorate the Spanish-American War. An American official called it a splendid little war. For the first time, America fought overseas. It began in the spring of 1898, when the United States decided to free Cuba from Spanish rule. Theodore Roosevelt, the young Assistant Secretary of the Navy, sent a small American squadron against the Spanish fleet in the Philippines. As he steamed into Manila Bay, Commodore George Dewey gave an order to his flagship captain. "You may fire when you are ready, Mr. Gridley." It was no contest. Dewey sank the antiquated Spanish Armada in 7 hours. Only one American died of heat prostration. Dewey later returned home to a tumultuous ovation. Americans also celebrated their new role as a world power, despite divisions over whether to keep the Philippines. In Washington, President McKinley and his cabinet pondered their next move. After much debate, McKinley decided to make the Philippines an American colony. Meanwhile, the Filipinos had declared independence and founded a republic. Emilio Aguinaldo, their president, had fought the Spanish for years. His young officers, drawn mostly from prominent families, hoped for U.S. recognition, but the Americans rejected them. On the night of February 4th, 1899, a new war broke out, this time between Americans and Filipinos. Americans, filled with patriotism, had a new sense of mission.
But when they called for volunteers, there was an onrush of the young people. They had no trouble getting the young men to go and join. There was no draft. There wasn't a draft. Now, his father didn't want him to join, but he went right on and joined anyway because he said he had to go. They went there to try to free those people.
Harry Embry volunteered at the age of 17. When we interviewed him, he was 104, the last living veteran of the Philippine War. He died in 1988.
I wanted to see a foreign country. And I wanted to see mountains and the oceans. And it was a different world, so different from anything I'd ever seen. It's so different.
Official U.S. Army records still call it the Philippine Insurrection. In reality, it was a war of conquest that lasted 2.5 years. At its peak, 70,000 American soldiers were involved. A basket of carrier pigeons to deliver his dispatches, John Bass of Harper's Weekly covered the American troops in action.
As we approached Caloocan, the bullets came thicker and thicker. In the road, dead Filipinos lay here and there like disfigured dolls thrown away by some petulant child. Squads of men moved from house to house to try to clear out the remaining insurgents. But sharpshooters had lodged in the houses, and the town had to be burned.
It was hot, and it was a mosquito-infested country. You know, they traveled by foot. There was no other way of them traveling anywhere. And in their walking, his feet were injured that he never did recuperate from that walking and serving. And the shoes, sometimes they just wouldn't fit, and they'd have to wear them anyway. Really, his blanket was all he had. That was his bed. That was his tent. And the food was very poor. And the water was just whatever they could get. Those young men didn't mind it because they had already put their lives on the altar, you might say. And they had volunteered in the first place. So they had no idea or desire to turn back.
The war captured the imagination of Thomas Edison. With his newly invented movie camera, he reenacted heroic scenes of the fighting in New Jersey. The real war was not so glorious. Filipinos adopted guerrilla tactics, and American progress was slow. Determined to win, President McKinley declared, "The Philippines are ours. We must put down the rebellion." American commanders in the Philippines tried to manage the news through censorship. Correspondents eluded them by sending their dispatches from nearby Hong Kong. A year after the war began, John Bass was gloomy.
Why is it that the American outlook is blacker now than it has been since the beginning of the war? The equipment of the Army has been absurdly inadequate. To load volunteers down with 200 rounds of ammunition and one day's rations, and put on their heads felt hats used by no other army in the world in the tropics, is positively criminal. There are 5,000 men in the General Hospital today, or 16% of the whole army. The American advance has about reached the end of its rope. Unless the insurgents fall to pieces by natural disintegration, the insurrection will prosper for some time to come.
But Bass failed to see that the Americans were in fact winning. Early in 1901, they captured Emilio Aguinaldo, the Filipino leader. But on remote islands like Samar, the Filipino resistance continued. An episode that occurred there late in 1901 is now local folklore.
Asya naman era pangarani ng Amerikano na dininga balanhiga sa masakir may 201 at nga pagkuha ng Amerikano nga siya.
Captain Thomas W. Connell, a West Pointer, arrived in Samar with a company of 74 men. His orders were to crush the resistance.
Nakatira nagkukaniran mga tanom, kaperas nirang kuan, kamutis, himhover, ang susunog, ang mga humay. Nawawala na nira pagkaon. Wala naman lalaki na makapagtrabaho, kaya ito man mga priso. Anpisan ko aga ito nga 28, ginordina niya ang mga kabayan niya. Early in the morning, incredible aga, mag-evacuate. Mapait naman hirahan.
On the morning of September 26, 1901, as the American troops were eating breakfast, the Filipinos struck. The Filipinos, many disguised as women, had concealed their weapons. They took the Americans by surprise. 52 Americans were killed, 22 escaped by boat. The massacre shocked the U.S. public. Major Littleton Waller was ordered to retaliate. His commander, General Jacob Smith, told him to kill every Filipino over the age of 10. Smith was court-martialed, convicted, and dismissed. American newspapers that once supported the war were now critical of the struggle. The American public, once enthusiastic, was now disgusted by its brutality. By now, some 200,000 Filipinos had been killed, most of them civilians. 4,000 American soldiers were dead. But the Americans finally imposed peace and began their colonial rule. They hoped to implant American values, and they made education a priority. 1,000 American school teachers landed in 1901 and went to every part of the country.
There was a saying in those days that one American school teacher was worth 1,000 American soldiers in the problem of pacifying the Philippines. That's obviously an exaggeration, but there's no question that an unarmed American was ready to go out there and teach these kids how to talk English. Was far more powerful than a soldier carrying a gun around. But their job was fighting, and it was in contrast with the teacher's job. The two of them got the job done.
William Howard Taft, America's first civilian governor, shaped early colonial policy. The Filipinos, he said, were our little brown brothers. He hoped to convert them to American ways.
The idea was to create the first public school system in Asia. The Filipinos wanted their kids educated. The Spaniards had never made this possible for any except the rich. And the American teacher taught very quickly the Filipino parent that the way for his kid to get on in the world was to go to school and learn. That many a family sold its carabao in order to let a kid go to school. Although the schools were free, they lost one worker, and they had to buy textbooks. They had to buy clothes for their children. The living was rough, there's no doubt about that, compared to anything in the United States. It took them 6 weeks to get mail from their homes, and they would, sometimes they'd accumulate the mail and open it a day a week, and so they'd stay even with it. They wouldn't use it all up at once. One of the big books in my childhood was the Montgomery Ward Catalog, in which we would pick out all our Christmas presents that we wanted and send the order back in August or September, and we would have the things back in time for Christmas holiday. There were no Christmas trees as such, but palm tree would work all right. But there was this feeling that they were working on something very important, and they enjoyed it. So there was a missionary zeal. Simply, we are working in a new field, and we're creating a nation.
I could tell you who the American presidents were, when the American Civil War was, why it was fought, and so forth and so on. I couldn't tell you what the heroes of the Philippines were, except for a few.
The curriculum was designed so that we would learn more of American principles and American ideas than of ourselves. The content was American, and it was so designed as to make us believe that the American was 10 feet tall.
The acceptance of English here was complete, total, unresisted. I think because it came with education, with the educational system. But of course, a language never comes just as like an empty train. It always comes loaded with this culture. So along with it came American values, American heroes, American stories, history. I think an immediate reaction was that people started to sing American songs and dress American, such that maybe the Filipino equivalent of the flapper would be the Filipina who moved from wearing the traditional terno, the Filipino dress, to the short American dress, low-waisted, started to curl her hair. Filipinas usually have long, straight hair in buns or something. And started to maybe smoke cigarettes, which horrified the older people. So in came American songs, eventually American movies, American radio programs, magazines, comic books, and this just transformed the Filipino into, instead of a Hispanic model, into an American model. They saw themselves acting and dressing as people in the American movies and in the American magazines.
Ano nangyari sa'yo? Hindi ganyan ang pagkanta niya. Kantahin mo kagaya ng dati.
Bakit niyo ako pilit-pilit pa kantahin ng English? Sinabi ko na sa inyo hindi ako maaari. Bakit din niyo ako pagtahin ng Tagalog?
Hoy, alamin mo na tayo nasa Manila. At ang dapat mong kantahin ay English. Sapagkat ang nakikinig, nasusunod na sa mga kantang Tagalog. Ulitin natin.
Upper-class Filipino families dreamed of sending their children to college in the United States. Americanization was the key to success.
All the first scholars were taken from all the top families in every province. So, since my father belonged to that level, he and his brother were chosen.
He was sent to a small teacher's college in Macomb, Illinois. He was completely brainwashed. I mean, he loved Americans, the American way of life. He loved American food. Oh, he enjoyed himself very much, and he learned a lot. Now, I come to the Philippines, come back home to an American-run colony. And these young men who just came from the States and learned all about equality and freedom and democracy, and then were shocked to find out that in their own country, the Americans had set aside certain areas where they were not even supposed to show their brown faces.
I recall as a law student, I was a reporter for a Spanish paper, and I went to the university club, which is American, and I was thrown out of it. And I was not the only one. There were other cases where Filipinos were thrown out of the Army and Navy Club. And this of course, created a lot of ruckus here, because we couldn't imagine ourselves being thrown out of places within our own country. But that was the exception rather than the rule. Otherwise, the relationship was very cordial.
The pace of life in Manila during the 1920s and 30s was leisurely, especially for rich Filipinos in the American community. Colonial status gave Americans luxuries and privileges they could never enjoy at home. Jack Manning grew up in Manila.
They were delightful years for me, living a young colonial life that was very, very pleasant. And our associations there were primarily with Europeans and Americans. My life was primarily Polo Club, Army-Navy Club. I like to think back of something my mother said about me, and that was that I was 21 years old before I learned to tie my own shoelaces, because it had always been done for me as I grew up.
We had a gardener, we had a houseboy, we had a chauffeur, we had a cook. So sure, from that standpoint, it was a great life. Malacanang Palace had some of the great parties of all time. Frank Murphy, of all people, would invite the prettiest Filipino girls in the world there. He had great orchestras. He brought in Gershwin's music from time to time. And Murphy was a bachelor, but he set the pace for a very good gay life among Americans and Filipinos both.
America imposed a typically colonial economy. The Philippines produced commodities for the U.S. market, chiefly timber, minerals, coconut oil, and sugar. And American business enjoyed a monopoly in the Philippines for its exports. The system favored big Filipino landlords and discouraged the growth of local industry. In 1916, the U.S. Congress pledged eventual freedom to the Filipinos.
We were promised independence, and we believed that it was coming, that it was just a matter of time, that if we were ready for it, we would get it. Now that the American government was here, was hopefully a very temporary thing.
Filipinos frequently demonstrated for independence, but there was little hostility toward the United States.
13 million Filipinos have an abiding faith in the righteousness of the American people. They trust that as America loves freedom, so freedom will be granted them. When that is accomplished, America will have written the noblest page in history, and the Filipinos will look back with gratitude upon the day God gave victory to American arms at Manila and placed their country under the benign guidance of the United States.
Filipino delegations traveled to Washington to negotiate independence. But many Filipinos feared freedom and the loss of the U.S. market for their goods. They also worried that America's departure would leave them unprotected. Some even wanted to make the Philippines a State of the Union. Manuel Quezon was president of the Philippine Commonwealth, signed into law by President Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1934. Independence was scheduled in 10 years.
We are about to establish and put into operation the government of the Commonwealth of the Philippines as ordained by the Congress of the United States. This event is another landmark in your steady progress toward the fulfillment of your aspirations to be a completely independent, sovereign nation.
I, Manuel Luis Quezon, hereby solemnly swear that I will faithfully and conscientiously fulfill my duties as President of the Philippines, and I hereby declare that I recognize and accept the supreme authority of the United States of America in the Philippines, and will maintain true faith and allegiance thereto. So help me God. This, ladies and gentlemen, my wife, Mrs. Quezon, my supporter, friend, and companion, and the dear mother of these children. This is Aurora, the eldest. That is Zoraida, the next. And this boy is the crown prince. Well, now, boy, don't you want to say something to the children of America?
I send them my love.
But Japan now threatened Asia, and America trained the Filipinos to defend themselves. The program was entrusted to a veteran Philippine hand, General Douglas MacArthur.
The Philippines Defense Act is, in effect, a charter of individual liberty and national freedom. Its purpose is to preserve the integrity of the only Christian state in the Far East, to perpetuate ideals of religious freedom, personal liberty, and republican government which have, under American tutelage, flowered here into fruition. The government simply provides a means whereby its citizens may be so organized, equipped, and trained as to be prepared and ready to defend their country. The plan is a pure product of democracy.
We felt if the war was going to start on the mainland of Asia, there would be no way that it would not involve the Philippines. And to us, the position in the Philippines was crucial. It was our possession. It was, nobody liked the word colony, but it was our colony. And we felt that we should protect the Philippines in the same way we would protect California or the state of New Hampshire.
The Philippines was not ready for war, but then it came without warning. The Japanese struck on December 8, 1941, at the same time they attacked Pearl Harbor.
The Japanese planes were so low that we could see the pilots. We could see pilots just waving out at almost like a cartoon where they were waving out to the people below. And there were people in our office that were sure that these were German pilots. So a good many of us still had such a low opinion of Japanese capabilities that we didn't believe that they were Japanese planes. But the realities very quickly came into focus. And we realized that this was honest-to-God war.
General MacArthur was caught by surprise, and the Americans suffered heavily. Their naval base near Manila was destroyed. They lost almost all their planes on the ground. The Japanese claimed to be liberating the Philippines.
We were still in high school, and the Japanese propaganda machine was already working and telling us that this is no place for the Americans, this is a place for the Asians. Asia for the Asians, that's what they were saying.
The Japanese were aware of some of these social difficulties, and the first leaflet that they dropped and said that when we liberate you, this is the day of liberating the Filipinos, and when we liberate you, never again will you be aliens in your own land and restricted from the Army and Navy Club.
On December 22nd, 1941, the first waves of Japanese marched toward Manila. Most American and Filipino troops retreated to Corregidor and the Bataan Peninsula at the mouth of Manila Bay.
We knew that they were landing at other places in the Philippines. We knew there would be a pincers movement which would sooner or later close in on Manila. And the problem came, when do you say to the Filipino people, yes, Manila is going to fall? On December 22, orders came from Washington that the military forces should make Manila an open city, and I had no written instructions, deliberately so, and I was simply told to do the best I can, and that was all.
As the Japanese entered Manila, the American and Filipino forces were trapped on Bataan and Corregidor. They were short of food, water, and medicine. On orders from Washington, General MacArthur escaped to Australia with his family. President Quezon went with him.
When I landed on your soil, I said to the people of the Philippines whence I came, I shall return. Tonight, I repeat those words. I shall return.
There was no escape for the American and Filipino soldiers.
On the 9th of April of 1942, we were forced to surrender. It was just really a fight to the death. It was just the last ditch stand. We had not encouragement, but direction from General MacArthur's headquarters that you will fight to the bitter end. Surrender is hopeless. It'd be futile to surrender. So we tried to abide by those instructions, but finally it got to a point where we just couldn't resist any longer. We had to give up. Disease, starvation, even lack of water.
Never before had America been so badly beaten. The Japanese were the masters of Asia.
They assembled us in groups of 104 abreast, searched us, took away whatever they wanted, and practically everything we had they took away. We heard continuous shots during the march. If you straggled or if you fell down exhausted, that was sudden death. They didn't have time for it. That was the end of it.
A Japanese soldier, I looked down on him to a certain extent because he was so small, except for the fact that his rifle made him look a hell of a lot taller. He come across the road and pulled my canteen out of my cover. And took a big drink of water out of my canteen, pulled the plug out of his canteen and filled his canteen out of mine, poured the rest of my water out on the ground, and then threw the canteen down in front of me. The next morning, they took me and beat me up both sides of my damn legs. I still got scars there where they beat me. It antagonized me at the time, and I'm still antagonized. It's been 45 years, and I'm still mad.
There's really not anything pleasant that I can recall about the March of Death, except one thing, and that was the beautiful Filipino people who did their best very valiantly to help us, oftentimes at the risk of their own life. They would try to give you a drink of water, they would try to pass a piece of sugar to you, or whatever they could do to make it a little easier for you. And many of them were killed because of that. Because the Japanese did not want any Filipinos to display any affection or loyalty to the American forces. The bodies of dead Americans were literally just lining both sides of the road, both sides of the ditches were dead Americans. I saw a Japanese tank deliberately swerve from its course and run over an American and just flatten him into the ground. His body became a part of the road. He was so flattened. The tanks, the trucks, the artillery pieces moved by horses, by cavalry, coming in the opposite direction, just a massive cloud of dust.
The first thing I realized was the dust was so heavy, I couldn't see the guards across the road there. So I turned and made a break then.
Robinette was rescued by Filipino guerrillas, the Hooks, led by communists and socialists. They were mostly poor peasants who fought both their landlords and the Japanese.
We never had a base camp as such. Everything stayed on the move. The Japanese realized, because you had troops moving back and forth across the countryside, that they could not control any more of the population than what they could look at over a rifle barrel. If they were going to move, they had to move large units for protection. The other thing was to go ahead and disrupt their communication lines as much as possible, blow up their bridges. They used a lot of telephonic communication, and all it takes is a straight pin shot through a telephone wire to short-circuit the damn thing out. The individuals I was living with and working with, the farmers or the fishermen or the peon, they had very little. They worked their life away there for possibly as much as $100, $125 a year, but they could never get ahead. During the period of operations there, I never saw a landlord as such. They were all in Manila. I think part of it was possibly fear of the Hooks and what could happen. And part of it was the fact that it was easier living in Manila and collaborating with the Japanese.
The Japanese expected the Filipinos to welcome them as fellow Asians, and many did. Many more Filipinos were in the position of collaborators than were in the position of guerrillas. Everybody that could go to the hills or had relatives in the countryside called himself a guerrilla. And those that had nowhere to go, had no alternative, just simply had to live by their wits under the Japanese. And I sympathize, like anything, with these people who, with their protectors gone, which we Americans were, simply had to live. And there was no love of the Japanese, no hatred of the Americans. You simply had a real situation where you had to take care of yourself. The Japanese made Jose Laurel their puppet president. A noted lawyer, American educated, he had served Japanese firms in the Philippines before the war. He admired the Japanese for their discipline and sense of purpose. His son, Salvador, was elected vice president in 1986.
The reaction of my father when the Japanese offered to grant independence to the Philippines in 1943 was, of course, welcomed. How could anyone be against the grant of Philippine independence? But, of course, there were people who knew that independence under a Japanese-occupied Philippines was not going to be the real kind of independence that they had in mind.
The Japanese showered leaflets hailing independence. The collaborators went along, insisting that they were shielding the population from the Japanese.
And so it was up to them to continue in some kind of position of leadership, but they had new people behind them. Instead of the Americans wielding the actual power, the Japanese wielded the actual power, and they had to do what their Japanese masters forced them to do.
Now, therefore, I, Jose P. Laurel, President of the Republic of the Philippines, do hereby proclaim that a state of war exists between the Republic of the Philippines and the United States of America and Great Britain.
The Japanese interned American civilians at Santo Tomas, an ancient Spanish university on the outskirts of Manila.
Each room elected himself a leader, and the rooms and floors elected their leaders. And it wasn't long, a question of hours, before we had a group of responsible pre-war leaders duly elected by common consent to represent us. We had doctors and lawyers, and we had engineers and businessmen in the camp, and their wives and their children. We were short of food from the beginning. The Japanese permitted contact at what we called the gate, into which the Filipino friends were permitted to come and pass a package under Japanese supervision. We played softball right up to early 1944, and the Japanese were fascinated with that. The commandant's office, the staff all came down to watch our baseball. We even had marriages in the camp amongst internees. The rest of the community life was purely and simply, as I say, of tending to the garden, looking after the sick, and doing the best you could in the way of food for survival.
Japanese propaganda films made life look good for military prisoners. Sam Gracchio, a pilot, was among the captives.
In the Camp O'Donnell, the first camp that we were imprisoned in, they buried 1,100 Americans and 14,000 Filipinos in just a 2-month period. Americans were dying at about 150 a day. Filipinos were dying at about 500 a day. Dead bodies would be around the camp maybe for 2 or 3 days before they were recovered and put in a grave. The food was bad. You lined up. It'd take you forever and a day to get through the mess line. It was terrible rice, worms and rocks in the rice. They had one water spigot for almost 15,000 people. Many guys stayed in line 8, 9, 10 hours. They would get to the water spigot. The Japanese would turn the water off. I came to the conclusion during the first 2 or 3 months of imprisonment that the Japanese had an intention. They wanted us to die.
The Japanese occupation was one of the most traumatic periods of my life. I can hardly talk about it still. The Japanese occupation had taught the whole people that the only way you could survive was to take what wasn't yours. Lots of people did things that they would not ordinarily have done. Fathers would keep food from their sons, and brothers would keep food from their sisters. And then old friends would deny each other just a spoonful of powdered milk or sugar. So that in those 3 years, the entire fabric of society, of morality, of ethics, became that you had to do whatever you could to remain alive. There were guns hidden under our house, and my father-in-law gave contributions to the guerrillas. And somebody must have tipped off the Japanese about that. We didn't know. In one night, 6 men were taken away from our home. my husband, my father-in-law, my brother-in-law, the cook, the houseboy, and the carpenter. They didn't explain. They just came in and herded everybody into the sub kitchen, and then tortured the men, searched the house, took all the men away to be shot.
In October 1944, American forces returned to the Philippines.
2 days before the October 20th landing, Halsey's fleet came into the Tacloban area, bombarding the whole area with fire. I'll tell you, it was a night of hell, but yet it was welcomed because they knew that MacArthur was returning. And despite the bombardment of the beaches and in the area there was no sign of resentment at all on the people. It was a welcome thing because they knew that liberation was coming. It was a remarkable scene to see because there was a fleet of some 600 ships. We had all these battleships and hundreds and hundreds of small landing craft that were out in the bay at Tacloban. The tears come streaming down your face as if something. It was just a beautiful thing. Just a beautiful thing to be able to witness the liberation of so many people who wanted so badly and so desperately to be liberated. And here it was. Here it was. The man was coming. I shall return, and he kept his promise.
When we heard that MacArthur landed in Leyte, all of us went to town and we were running after the tanks and we say, Uncle Sam, give us chocolate. Beautiful, beautiful. I can still remember that. Gratitude is the greatest virtue. And therefore you cannot talk against MacArthur here. They will stone you. Because that man saved us. Because he promised this country, I shall return. And he did return.
The battle for Luzon, the most populous Philippine island, was one of the biggest of World War II. Early in 1945, American forces entered Manila. Their first objective was to free the American civilians interned at Santo Tomas.
And food was brought in to the camp area where you could have seen the delight, the smiles and the cheers as these crates of food were carried into the area. And the internees had to be reminded that they couldn't help themselves too much to the food because having been on such short rations for so many years, having a filled stomach could make them very ill. But there were many, many sick stomachs because it was the first time they had seen food in such abundance.
But the battle for Manila was just beginning. To spare civilians, MacArthur refused to allow airstrikes. His artillery was just as destructive. The main Japanese force withdrew from the city, but many enemy troops remained. Trapped, they unleashed their fury on the population.
So the rest of Manila, south of the river, the Pasig River, was cut off. And there the Japanese went on a rampage. They knew they were trapped, and so I think they just went crazy. It was an orgy of killing and destruction, completely insane. Japanese soldiers bayoneting children, and then shooting at women and old men when they cross the streets, and just setting fire to houses and waiting until their occupants ran into the street and then shooting them down. And in Ermita, they took away droves of young girls to the Bayview Hotel, and I could hear their screams as they were being raped.
Along with Warsaw, Manila was the most devastated Allied city of World War II. At least 100,000 civilians were killed.
Manila was flat. I was breathless when I stood at the post office and I could look all the way up to past the Ateneo to LaSalle. It's a stretch of about 2 kilometers. It was flat. There was not left a stone upon a stone. You couldn't find out where a house was. You couldn't even find a corner from which to measure off where the house ought to be. It was flat.
Blair Robinette was now a guerrilla commander north of Manila.
The Americans rolled in, and when I first saw them, it looked to me like the German army. Different helmets, equipment I'd never seen before, vehicles I'd never seen before. Everything was strange. They wanted to know who was in charge, and I told them I was. The American captain told me, he said, well, disband your men because we're here, we'll take over now. And I said, do you have any way you could use them? He said, no. He said, just disband them. So I assembled everybody, give them a hail and farewell speech, and told them to go back to the farms and be good boys.
But his wartime guerrillas, the Hooks, kept their weapons and later rebelled against the government. Impoverished peasants, they wanted land of their own.
They deserved far better than what they had. And the only thing that I could see that would have provided it would have been massive land reforms in the Philippines.
But MacArthur was no reformer. His aim was to restore the old Filipino power structure. He also restored America's influence, which was to remain decisive even after the Philippines became independent.
I see that the old flagstaff still stands. Have your troops hoist the colors to its peak, and let no enemy ever haul them down.
This program will be presented again tomorrow afternoon at 1:30. Be with us next Monday night at 9.